This is The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Alice Lagnado. Welcome to Curtain Up, our show all about Russian culture. Many people in the UK know about the giants of Russian culture like Dostoyevsky or Rachmaninov, but less well known are the films and songs of popular Russian culture, which sometimes provide more clues to the country than the high arts. Olga Fedina has written a book called What Every Russian Knows and You Don't, which explains key elements of Russian popular culture to foreigners. I invited Olga into the studio and started by asking her why the film Irony of Fate or Enjoy Your Bath is one of the essentials for anyone interested in Russia.
I think now it's partly nostalgia and partly habit. It's almost as essential on the New Year's Eve as a Russian salad, Olivier. It's a film which is a mixture of so many different things. On the one hand, it's the comedy of errors. On the other hand, it's quite a positive film. It's also quite a sad film as well. It's very bittersweet, which Russians, I think, really like. I think there are very few successful Russian comedies which are just purely comedies. The songs to this film are all beautiful, and the lyrics for the songs are by famous poets. They're all very sad as well. All the songs that are used in this film are very sad. It's a bit of a mixture of when you want to believe in miracle, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you kind of know that miracles don't usually happen. And then it takes you into this melancholic but quite pleasant state. And that's probably the new year. You also want to believe the new year is going to be better. You always want to be taken away by this winter magic. And then there's something in you which also makes you sad because another year has passed and who knows what the next one brings.
And it's also a very funny film, isn't it? And some of the humour is drawn from Soviet life. You know, the fact that he gets a bit drunk in the Banya, the Russian sauna, and gets on a plane to Leningrad, the former name for St. Petersburg, and finds himself at a flat that's almost identical to his own from the outside and even partly from the inside.
Yes, and even the key fits.
It's incredible, isn't it? And even now, flats from the outside, there are a lot of big blocks in Russia, aren't there, that would be the same, even though I'm sure inside things are very different. So there's a lot of humour there that I think maybe would be hard to understand if you hadn't had any experience of Soviet life, or at least would be more appreciated had you been there.
Certainly. People who traveled around Russia do notice that whichever town you go, maybe the center would be different, the historic center, but if you go to the suburbs, the Soviet suburbs are just so uniform. And that's the satirical message of the film, because the film starts with a little animated cartoon of an architect who has this brilliant project. And he goes from one bureaucrat to another, and each bureaucrat takes a little detail from the project until what he's left with is just a very uniform, square Soviet concrete building. And of course, I grew up in one of those. So for me, it's something very familiar. And maybe when you grow up like that, you don't think about it so much either.
I wanted to move on now to your chapter on Vladimir Vysotsky. He was a singer who is not very well known in the West, even though he's known by every Russian and his songs are marvellous. But I do think you can enjoy his songs more and appreciate them if you do know at least a bit of the language. What do you think?
Of course. Vysotsky was really a poet who sang his songs. So his music as such may not be so interesting. He has a lot of charm and he has a lot of intensity. The way he sings is quite mesmerizing, maybe even for people who don't understand the lyrics. But of course, the most important in his songs are the lyrics. What's very important, what I think made him so popular, is that he could really get under the skin of different people, different personalities, people from different social classes or from different professions, different ages. And this is why so many people in the Soviet Union could relate to his songs, because he could be singing in one song, he would be a criminal, then he would be a soldier in a trench, then he would be a housewife. Then he would be some inanimate object like a fighter plane or a submarine. And what's really interesting, and what I can't imagine happening now, for example, at the age of internet, is that when he was so popular, many people knew very little about him because he hardly had any official recordings.
Yes, you said that in the book. I was very struck by the fact that he had few recordings, he wasn't in the press, and yet mass popularity.
Yes. So there was some semi-underground concerts And then people would tape them and then make
Pass them
copies, copies of the tapes. Of course, my father had a huge tape recorder with Vysotsky cassettes, and his voice from so many copying just became almost unrecognizable. Sometimes you couldn't even hear the words very well because the quality was so bad.
But I do think that's one of the most interesting and appealing things about Vysotsky is his voice. It's not a sort of pretty voice. It's not but it really has a lot of spirit in it. And the other connection, I guess, is that people here don't sit around with the guitars at home, and people in Russia still do. And so that's also perhaps why his songs carry on, because people will play them at home.
I think so. And almost everyone who can play 3 chords on the guitar can play Vysotsky's song. So, when I was small, my father would get a guitar from time to time out of the corner and sort of blow away the dust and sing a Vysotsky song.
And it strikes me that he wasn't very political either, so he didn't turn people off.
So he wasn't a dissident in the kind of sense that a dissident being, somebody who is sort of against the government, or I think he even saw the dissidents as people who undermine the structure of his country. He was critical to certain phenomena of Soviet life, but quite mildly critical. And when I think why he was actually banned, or why he wasn't banned, but why he was completely unofficial. I think his way of being a dissident was that he just described life as it was. And this wasn't normal in the Soviet Union. Because in the Soviet Union, the reality and the official culture there was a huge gap between the reality and the official culture.
But even in the West, I mean, there is that tradition of singer-songwriters who tell the real story, and they're never people who follow the government line, are they?
No. It's by definition, singer-songwriter should be somebody critical.
And he also wrote about alcohol. He did drink, and he died very young at the age of 42, and so he described that as well, didn't he, very truthfully?
Yes, he did. And sometimes quite comically as well. There would be songs where, 2 alcoholics who would be taken by the police, and they just, wake up in a cell and tell their story, what they were doing. They're trying to remember what they did before. And it was quite funny for many Russians, even though, when you think of it, it's not that funny. but many Russians could relate to that. Because he was a very normal person. He was seen as just one of the people.
A guy, yes, a mujik, a bloke. I mean, and he was a terrific actor too, which we should mention. I mean, anyone who wants to look up his films, the film about the Black Cat Gang.
Место встречи изменить нельзя.
Yes, I think in English we'd call it something like you can't change the time and place when you meet, or something a bit neater than that. But it's not a film that's well known here, even though you can actually get it with subtitles. But unfortunately, like a lot of brilliant Soviet films, it just hasn't been promoted here that much. People don't know much about it. It's a wonderful atmospheric film, as is one of the other films mentioned in your book, Moscow Does Not Believe in Tears. Now, this got a bit more play in the West.
And it won an Oscar.
Indeed. So that film's gone a bit further, but it's still not something that's widely known here, I'd say.
It's a bit of its time as well.
I mean, yes, those characters and that life don't really exist anymore in quite the same way, do they?
Maybe not. And that particular film, well, there's a lot of critical things you could say about that film. Even the actor who played the main role, even he was slightly critical. It can be seen as supporting sort of male chauvinism a little bit, because there is this woman who really achieved everything on her own. She has a daughter, but she's very unhappy because she's in her 40s and she doesn't have a life partner. And then she meets this man on a train.
Gosha.
Well, and Gosha, she quickly realizes she cannot tell him she's a director of the factory, because Gosha is not going to accept that a woman can have a higher position than him and earn more money. And there's a bit of a kind of clash, because she's so used to order people around. And he is not used to being ordered around at all. But then you could say, well, the actor who played the main role, said that maybe the Soviet audience, maybe all those women in the Soviet audience who fell in love with Gosha didn't actually see that he was a man who was fighting, who solved problems by fists, who were bothering women on trains. And
yes, but he also helped her, didn't he? He helped Katya with her son, who had some problems, and he provided companionship for her, and he became her lover. You know, I guess we oughtn't to judge it in terms of Western feminist standards.
No, we shouldn't. But that's probably why this film looks so dated, because it does a bit. It's an interesting, it's an interesting document of its epoch, and it's a good film.
I was going to ask you about that actually, because I'm not sure that things have changed so radically in terms of relations between the sexes since that time in Russia. But
no, probably not. It probably depends where you are as well. Maybe in the big cities things have changed, but
there are certainly plenty of strong women still in Russia managing a lot by themselves. And she's incredibly beautiful too, on top of everything else. She's a wonderful character and a wonderful actress. I must say, for me, the difficulty with that film wasn't the fact that Gosha was a man's man and he was in charge within the family unit. It was the happy ending after all those twists and turns, because throughout the film you actually see unhappy... I mean, it doesn't just idealise Soviet life. The women there have some real difficulties with men and with their lives and have a really tough time. And that's very sympathetic and very appealing. But I think perhaps the ending is the bit that slightly lets it down for me.
I think it would be so disappointing if it didn't have a happy ending.
Yes, and maybe it's also the ending is about the fact that Katya did want to be with somebody and not to have to be alone all her life.
Yes, and she really deserved to be lucky. She really deserved to be happy.
Finally.
Yes.
Well, it's a beautiful film, and I hope people keep watching it. I have come across something in Russia I wanted to put to you. I've met some young people in their 20s who have told me that films like this aren't relevant to them and that they don't really connect to the characters. I was quite taken aback, and I thought, well, maybe things have just changed. This is just a new generation. Have you come across that?
I have come across that. And of course, it is a new generation. I wrote this book and I'm 40, and of course I understand much better people my age or even older, people who grew up during the Soviet Union. So for me, the young generation, the generation who have never known that world, is harder to understand. I did try to make sure that what I included in the book, in one way or the other, was, if not relevant, at least familiar to young Russians. But of course, there's a bigger gap between 20 and 40-year-old Russians than probably even between 20 and 40-year-old UK people, because the Russian world now is so different from the Soviet world.
It did strike me also about your book that it underlines the fact that language is key to understanding Russian culture, more than in perhaps some other countries, I don't know, but certainly for me that's been the case. And a lot of the things you mentioned, the films, the comedians, the cartoons and so on, are really better understood with a bit of knowledge of Russian. So what interests me is how we bring Russian culture to people who don't and won't ever necessarily understand Russian. I think it's quite tough to enable people to appreciate some of these things. I think it's always going to be a difficult one.
I think so, but I think it's probably true about any culture. I'm learning Chinese now, for example. If you want to understand Chinese culture, it's really, really important to be learning the language, at least to some degree, because the characters tell you so much about the way the Chinese think. Right,
but the context is that in this country, Russian departments, universities are closing, not opening. It does strike me, though, that at least that this book should be required reading for university students of Russian, and, perhaps that people at university should be reading and looking at some of the things you mention in the book and not only reading Pushkin and Dostoyevsky.
I think so. I agree. The universities are very much focused on high Russian culture. But then the popular culture tells a lot about people's mentality. It tells a lot about history as well. It teaches you language, day-to-day language that people use. So I think there should be more focus on that.
Olga Fedina talking to me, Alice Lagnado, about her book, What Every Russian Knows and You Don't. And that ends this edition of Curtain Up, our show all about Russian culture. Stay tuned.